My parents told me they were living on a fixed pension. They said they had nothing left, that retirement had quietly eaten through everything they'd set aside, that every dollar was already spoken for. That was 4 years ago, when my son was 9 years old, and the doctors in Ottawa were running out of options. I still remember the exact number: $46,000. That was what the clinic in Cleveland was asking for, an accelerated treatment program, a specialized immune therapy that simply wasn't available in Ontario yet, hadn't been approved yet, was still sitting somewhere in the middle of a provincial review process that would take another 18 to 24 months. My son's gastroenterologist had been the one to suggest it. She'd printed out 3 pages of research, handed them to me across her desk, and said very carefully that she wasn't able to recommend we wait for the public system to catch up. He had a rare autoimmune liver condition. His body was attacking itself. The standard treatment protocol existed, yes, but the waiting list for the specific intervention he needed was 14 months at minimum, and she didn't believe he had 14 months. My husband and I had savings. Not much. We'd bought our house in Canada 5 years before, and between the mortgage and 2 car payments and the ordinary weight of being a family, we had maybe $11,000 sitting in a joint account that was supposed to be an emergency fund. We cashed it out the same week. We called every family member we could think of. My husband's parents sent $3,000 from their retirement savings in New Brunswick, and I cried so hard on the phone, I couldn't properly thank them. My aunt in Winnipeg sent $500 and said she wished it could be more. Friends from my old neighborhood did a fundraiser online. Strangers donated. People we had never met sent $20 and messages that said they were praying for our family, that they hoped our little boy would be okay. We were still $31,000 short. I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon in October. My mother made tea. My father sat in his armchair the way he always did, with the television on low in the background, and I sat across from them at the kitchen table, and I explained everything I had already explained twice by phone. The treatment, the timeline, the clinic, the amount. I had a folder. I had printed everything out. Every document. Every piece of correspondence from the clinic coordinator in Cleveland, because I thought if they could see it in front of them, they would understand how real this was. My mother kept saying she wished there was something they could do. My father said the healthcare system in this country was supposed to handle these things, and that $46,000 wasn't the kind of money people just had sitting around, and that he and my mother were on a fixed income, and there wasn't anything left at the end of the month. There really wasn't, and he was sorry. He was truly sorry, but there was nothing he could do. I drove home. I kept both hands on the wheel the entire way, and I didn't cry until I pulled into our driveway, and then I sat in the car for a long time. We kept fundraising. My husband picked up contract work on evenings and weekends. I sold things. We borrowed what we could. By January, we had $22,000, and my son had been admitted to CHIO for the second time in 3 months, and his numbers were getting worse, not better. He passed away on a Thursday in March. He was 9 years old. He had his father's eyes, and he'd recently become obsessed with the Ottawa Senators in a way that delighted my husband and broke my heart a little with how passionately he argued with anyone who questioned his teams. Chance. He had this laugh. I don't know how to describe it, except to say it was the kind of laugh that made whatever room he was in feel warmer. He was 9 years old, and he was the best person I had ever known, and we had $31,000 less than what we needed to save him. The 2 years after that are not something I can describe clearly. I went back to work. My husband and I held our marriage together through something that I think can only be called shared grief and stubbornness. My parents came to the funeral. My mother wept. My father put his hand on my shoulder and said my son was at peace now. My brother and his wife drove down from their place in Markham, and my brother hugged me in the parking lot of the funeral home and said he was so sorry. He was so sorry. He couldn't imagine what we were going through. I believed him. I believed all of them. Grief does that. It makes you too tired to be suspicious. It was my cousin who told me. Not on purpose, I don't think. We were at a family dinner the following Christmas, 14 months after the funeral, and someone mentioned my brother's new place, the house he and his wife had just bought in Stouffville, And my cousin said something offhand about how it was wonderful that my parents had been able to help with the down payment, that it was such a generous thing to do. She said it the way people say things they assume everyone already knows. I set down my fork. I asked her, very quietly, what she meant. She looked at me, and her face changed, and she said she must have misunderstood. She wasn't sure. She'd probably gotten confused. But I kept asking. Gently, persistently. The way you ask when you already know the answer is going to rearrange something inside you that you will never fully put back. My parents had given my brother $78,000. They had transferred it to him in 2 installments over the course of a year, $40,000 for the down payment on the Stouffville house, and $38,000 more for a renovation to his basement suite. $78,000. To the same people who had sat across from me at their kitchen table while I showed them every document, every piece of paper, every correspondence from the Cleveland clinic, and told me they had nothing left at the end of the month. I didn't say anything that night. I drove home and I sat in my kitchen, and I looked at the wall for a very long time. My husband came downstairs and found me there, and I told him what I had learned, and I watched his face go through everything mine had already gone through. He reached across the table and held my hand, and neither of us said anything for a while. I want to be honest about what happened after that. I didn't confront them. Not right away. Part of me didn't want to confirm it. Part of me thought that if I asked, and they admitted it, something would collapse, that I wasn't ready to have collapse. So, I waited. I checked. I had a coffee with my brother's wife one afternoon in February, and I let her talk about the house and the renovation, and at some point I asked, as neutrally as I could manage, whether they'd had much help with the financing. She said yes, my parents had been incredibly generous, that they'd helped with the down payment and some of the reno costs, that she and my brother were so grateful because saving for a house in the GTA on their own would have taken years more. She said this to me. She said it the way you say something to someone who already knows. I went to my parents' house the following week. I drove alone. My mother made tea again because that is what she does, that is how she handles everything, and I sat down at the same table where I had sat with my folder of documents and my printed out correspondence from the clinic coordinator in Cleveland, and I asked them directly. I didn't raise my voice. I asked them when they had transferred the money to my brother, and whether they understood that the total they had given him was more than enough to have saved my son's life. My mother started to cry. My father looked at his hands. There was a long silence, and then he said that it wasn't as simple as I was making it sound, that the money had come through at different times, that they hadn't realized, and I stopped him there. I told him the transfer to my brother had been made 4 months before my son died. I had confirmed the dates. I told him I wasn't there to scream or to punish them. I just needed them to know that I knew. I needed to say it out loud. In front of them, in the same room where they had told me, there was nothing left at the end of the month. My mother asked me what she could do. I told her my son was gone, and that fact was not going to change, and I was going to have to learn to live beside it for the rest of my life, and that the only difference now was that I was going to do that without them. I changed my phone number. I didn't block them exactly. I simply stopped being available. I stopped attending family dinners. My husband supported every decision I made without question, and I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life. My brother tried to reach me a few times. He left voicemails that said he wanted to explain, that he hadn't known what was happening with us when he accepted the money, that he would have said something if he'd realized. I didn't call back. I don't know if I believed him or not. I'm not sure it mattered. I built a quiet life. That's the only way I know how to describe the 18 months that followed. I went back to the community health center, where I worked as a client coordinator. I started running in the mornings. My husband and I talked about whether we wanted to try again for a child, and we agreed we weren't ready, but that we weren't closed to it either. We drove to New Brunswick one summer to visit his parents, and sat on their porch in the evenings, and watched the water, and I thought about how grief has a texture, how it's not always sharp, how some days it's just a heaviness that sits in the room with you, and you learn to set a place for it and keep going. It was a Tuesday in September, when my mother called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I didn't know who it was. She said my brother had been rushed to a hospital in Markham 3 days earlier with an acute cardiac crisis. He had a rare heart condition, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, complicated by an arrhythmia that had gone undetected for years. He had survived the initial event, but the damage to his heart muscle was significant. He needed a specialized procedure, and the recovery would be long, and the cardiologist had said his long-term prognosis depended on several factors, one of which was a bone marrow treatment that could support cardiac muscle regeneration, an emerging therapy being trialed at a hospital in Toronto. There was a pause. And then my mother told me the rest. They had done a family compatibility screening. My father wasn't a match. My mother wasn't a match. My brother's wife wasn't a match. His children weren't old enough to be tested. The genetics of the specific cell therapy required a sibling match with a particular HLA profile. I was the only sibling he had. The cardiologist had said they needed to know quickly. They had perhaps 6 weeks before the window for this therapy closed, and my brother's treatment options narrowed significantly. My mother asked me if I would come in for a compatibility test. I held the phone against my ear, and I looked out the window of my office at the parking lot and the trees beyond it, which were beginning to turn, the way they do in Ontario in September, gold and rust, and a particular shade of orange that I have always loved. I thought about my son. I thought about the folder of documents I had carried to that kitchen table. I thought about $46,000 and $78,000 and the 14 months my son never had. I said I needed time to think. My mother said, of course, take all the time you need. And then she asked again when I thought I might have an answer, and I told her I would call her. I hung up. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark next to my husband, and I stared at the ceiling, and I tried to locate myself in the situation I was in. My husband was awake too. At some point he said, quietly, that whatever I decided, he was going to stand beside it. He said that no one had the right to demand anything of me, not my parents, not my brother, not anyone. He said I didn't owe them a single thing. And then he said, even more quietly, that he also knew me, and that whatever I decided was going to have to be something I could carry, not just now but 10 years from now. That was all he said. Then he was quiet again, and eventually, we both slept. I called my brother directly the next morning. Not my parents, my brother. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year, and hearing his voice was strange, like finding a photograph of a place you used to live. He sounded thin. He said my name, and then he didn't say anything else for a moment. I asked him to tell me, honestly, whether he had known when he accepted the money from our parents, whether he had known what our family was going through. There was a long pause. He said he hadn't known the full picture. He knew I had a sick child, but he hadn't understood how critical things were, hadn't understood the timeline, hadn't realized the money our parents were giving him was money that could have gone to the clinic in Cleveland. He said that when he found out months later, after everything, he hadn't been able to forgive himself either. I asked him why he hadn't called me. He said he was a coward. He said it plainly, without dressing it up. He said he was ashamed, and he handled that shame the way he handled most difficult things, which was by going quiet and hoping time would do something about it. He said he knew that wasn't good enough. He said he was sorry, not in the way people say sorry when they want something from you, but in the slow, flat way that tells you a person has been sitting with a thing for a long time and has run out of ways to say it. I don't know exactly what I felt in that moment. I'm not sure it was forgiveness. I think it was something closer to recognition, like seeing someone clearly for the first time, including their worst parts, and understanding that the worst parts didn't cancel out the rest. I went in for the compatibility test. The results came back 4 days later. I was a match. Not a partial match, a strong match, the kind the care team described as close to ideal for the therapy protocol. When the transplant coordinator called to tell me, she asked how I would like to proceed. I told her I needed another few days. I drove to my parents' house for the third and final time. I did not call ahead. My father answered the door. He looked older than I remembered, which sounds obvious, but it surprised me. I had frozen them somewhere in my mind, at the age they'd been, when I sat at their table with my folder, and standing at the door in the September afternoon light, my father looked diminished in a way I wasn't prepared for. I sat down at the kitchen table. My mother didn't make tea. I told them I was going to be tested as a donor. I told them I had decided to move forward with the procedure, that I was going to help my brother, not because I didn't remember what they had done, not because the last 4 years had been erased, but because my son had loved his uncle, and because I was not willing to become the kind of person who lets someone die when she has the ability to prevent it. I said that very clearly. I said, I am not willing to become that. I think we all understood why I was saying it. My mother reached across the table and tried to take my hand. I moved it back into my lap. I told them I had 2 things to say, and I needed them to listen without responding. My father nodded. The first thing was that I was not doing this for them. I was doing it for my brother, who had been honest with me in a way they had never been, and I was doing it for myself, because I had to be able to live with who I was. The second thing was that my decision to help my brother did not change anything between me and them. I was not ready to rebuild that. I didn't know if I ever would be. What they had done, what they had allowed to happen, was not something I could fold into a conversation over tea and come out the other side of unchanged. My son was not here. That was the fact I lived with every single day. And they had the capacity to have changed it, and they chose not to, and that choice had a weight to it that no amount of guilt or grief therapy or condo sale was going to lift. My father started to say something. I told him I wasn't finished. I said that I hoped, for their sake, that they would find some way to make peace with what they'd done. I said I wasn't going to carry their guilt for them. That was their work to do, not mine. I said that my brother's children deserved to have their father alive, and that was the only reason they were getting a phone call from me at all, and they should understand that clearly. Then I got up, and I drove home, and I called the transplant coordinator the same afternoon and told her I was ready to proceed. The procedure itself was outpatient, which surprised people when I told them. A peripheral blood stem cell collection. They stimulate the donor's bone marrow with injections for several days beforehand, and then the cells are collected through a process similar to a blood draw. It takes a few hours. I was tired afterward for about a week, achier than I expected, but I went back to work in 10 days, and by the end of the month I had mostly forgotten, physically, that it had happened. My brother's recovery was longer. The therapy worked gradually, incompletely at first, and then with more consistency over the following months. His cardiac function improved. He wouldn't play hockey again, his cardiologist told him. But he would see his kids grow up. He sent me a message when he got that news. It said, I don't have the words. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve this. I read it twice, and then I put my phone down. I don't know what our relationship will look like going forward. We've had coffee twice since the procedure, my brother and I, at a place near his house. It's careful between us. There's no pretending it isn't. He asks about my husband, about whether we've thought more about the future, about what I've been reading. I ask about his kids. We don't talk about our parents. There is so much that sits between us unspoken that some days, I think it might take years to sort through. And other days, I think maybe some of it doesn't need to be sorted through. Maybe some things can just be sat with. My parents reached out to ask if they could see me after the procedure. I told them I wasn't there yet. I don't know if I ever will be. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where I wrap everything up into a lesson about forgiveness and healing and the ways grief eventually softens, and I don't think that would be true. My son is gone. I am 34 years old, and I have buried my child. The people who could have helped and chose not to are his grandparents, and no therapy session or donated condo proceeds is going to change the arithmetic of that. What I can tell you is that I made the decision I had to make. Not for them, not to be the bigger person, not to perform grace, not because I believed I owed anyone anything. I made it because my son was the warmest, funniest, most wholehearted person I have ever known, and he would have hated the version of me that let someone die out of anger. He would have rolled his eyes at me, the way he did when I was being dramatic, and told me that that wasn't who I was. I still talk to him. Not out loud, usually mostly in the mornings, when I'm running and the streets are quiet and the light is still low over the fields near our neighborhood. I tell him about the things he would have loved, and the things that would have annoyed him, and the ways the world keeps moving, even when it shouldn't. Some mornings it feels unbearable. Some mornings it just feels like the way things are. I still see the sunrise every single day. I started doing that on purpose. The month after he died, because someone told me that grief needs an anchor, something you do consistently enough that it becomes part of how you survive. So every morning I find a window, or I step outside and I watch it. Every single one is different. Every one is still his. If you've made it to the end of this, I want to say something to anyone who is in the middle of something like this. A family that has failed you, a system that left you without options, a loss you are still learning to carry. You do not have to make the same decision I made. There is no script here. What I know is that the decision has to be yours, made from who you actually are, not who the grief has made you, or who the anger wants you to be. That's the only compass I had. I don't know if I got it right. I think I got it close enough to live with. And some days, that's all any of us are trying to do.